In 1946, a senior official inside the British Treasury wrote a private memorandum to the Chancellor of the Exchequer. It was marked confidential. It was never meant to be read by the public. In that memo, the official wrote, plainly and without apology, that Britain had exhausted its capacity to lead the world order. He wrote that the transition of financial and military supremacy to the United States was not merely inevitable. It was, in his words, already complete. Britain had not lost a war. Britain had not suffered a revolution. The British pound was still accepted in 80 countries. The Royal Navy still patrolled 3 oceans. And yet the men at the top of the British system knew, with absolute documented certainty, that the age was over, that the baton had been passed, and that most of their citizens had no idea. The question is not whether a superpower falls. Every one of them does. The question is who inside the system knows it first, and what do they do with that knowledge before the rest of us find out. Welcome to Econ Empires. I'm going to show you a pattern, not a theory, not a prediction, a documented, repeating, forensically verifiable pattern that has played out across 500 years of financial and imperial history. A pattern with a beginning, a middle, and an ending that is always the same. No matter the flag, no matter the century, no matter the ideology, once you see it, you cannot unsee it. And once you understand where we are inside it right now, you will never read the news the same way again. This is the British betrayal. Every reserve currency empire in recorded history has passed through the same 6 stages. I want you to hold these stages in your mind as we go, because we're going to trace each one through British history. And then we're going to locate the United States precisely inside the same sequence. Stage 1 is the productive ascent. A nation rises not through financial cleverness, but through physical dominance, superior technology, superior logistics, superior energy. It makes things, it ships things, it builds things. Its currency becomes trusted because its goods are wanted. Stage 2 is the financial pivot. As wealth accumulates and wages rise, the cost of production at home becomes uncompetitive. The elite, the merchant class, the banking class begin to ask a quiet but fatal question: why build when we can lend? The economy begins to shift from a production base to a financial base. Economists celebrate this as maturity. Historians recognize it as the beginning of the end. Stage 3 is the capital export. The financial class, now running an increasingly hollow domestic economy, seeks better returns abroad. They begin investing in the industries of rising competitors. They export the very machinery of productive power to nations that will use it to eventually replace them. They do this not from ignorance. They do it because the quarterly return is better. Stage 4 is the debt spiral. As the domestic economy hollows and social pressures mount, the state begins to borrow, first to fund wars that maintain imperial prestige, then to fund welfare that maintains social peace. The borrowed money comes, increasingly, from the same elite class whose capital is already abroad. The state becomes a debtor to its own aristocracy. Stage 5 is the institutional illusion. The great institutions, the central bank, the reserve currency, the military, continue to project strength long after the underlying reality has rotted. This gap between the appearance of power and the reality of power is where empires are most dangerous and where the elite most ruthlessly complete their exit. The illusion of power is not an accident. It is a feature. It buys the ruling class time to finish moving their wealth before the population understands what has happened. And stage 6 is the transfer. Not a crash, not a war, not an apocalypse, a handover, a negotiated, documented, carefully managed transfer of the financial architecture from one dominant system to the next. It is quiet, it is civilized, and it is devastating for anyone who was not part of the negotiation. Now let us apply this framework to the most documented case in modern history, the case that is closest to what is happening in the world right now. Let us talk about Britain. In 1850, Britain produced more iron than the entire rest of the world combined. Its textile mills in Manchester and Leeds clothed hundreds of millions of people across 5 continents. Its engineers built the railways of India, the bridges of South America, the harbor infrastructure of ports from Hong Kong to Cape Town. The British pound sterling was, without question or competition, the world's reserve currency, not by decree, not by military force, but because the productive reality behind it was undeniable. If you wanted to settle an international trade contract in 1870, whether you were a cotton merchant in Alexandria, a tea trader in Bombay, or a beef exporter in Buenos Aires, you settled it in pounds sterling. Because sterling was backed not just by gold held in the Bank of England, but by the productive capacity of an industrial civilization that had no peer. This is stage 1, the productive ascent. And Britain executed it with a completeness that history rarely sees. The steam engine, the spinning jenny, the power loom. These were not just inventions. They were force multipliers that gave Britain a 20-year head start on every other nation on Earth. By the time France and Germany began to industrialize seriously, Britain had already built the financial architecture to monetize its lead. The pound was trusted because British coal was real, British steel was real, and British ships were real. The currency was a receipt for something that actually existed. But here's where the British story becomes instructive and disturbing, because by 1870, the very success of the British industrial model had begun to generate the pressures that would, over the next 70 years, destroy it. Wages in Britain began to rise. The working class, organized into unions, represented in Parliament, increasingly literate and politically aware, demanded and received a larger share of the productivity gains. This was, in one sense, a triumph of civilization. In another sense, it was the beginning of the competitiveness problem. Building a locomotive in Birmingham was becoming more expensive than building one in Pittsburgh or Stuttgart. The arithmetic was turning. Simultaneously, something critical happened in the financial class. The great industrialists, the Rothschilds, the Barings, the merchant banking dynasties, began to look at their spreadsheets and ask the stage 2 question. Why should we build another factory in Lancashire when we can lend money to Argentina at 7%? Why should we manage the complexity of industrial production when we can simply hold government bonds? This is the moment the British Empire began to end, not the moment the Archduke was shot in Sarajevo, not the moment the German tanks crossed into Poland, the moment the British financial class decided that finance was more comfortable than production. That was the terminal diagnosis. Everything else was just the time it took to die. Between 1870 and 1914, Britain exported more capital than any nation in history. By some estimates, British investors held foreign assets equivalent to nearly 2 full years of British domestic output. This is an astonishing figure. It means that the British financial class had, in effect, built a second Britain, offshore, using the surplus generated by the first one. Where did this capital go? It went to the United States, to the railroads of Kansas and Nebraska, to the steel mills of Pennsylvania, to the telegraph networks of New York. British capital financed the very industrial infrastructure that would make the United States the world's largest economy by 1890. British investors bought the bonds of American states. British banks lent to American corporations. British insurance houses underwrote American risk. The logic was identical to the Dutch bankers who funded the British Navy a century earlier. The return was better. The American frontier offered yields that the saturated British domestic market could not match. And so the British financial elite did what financial elites always do at stage 3 of the cycle. They funded their own replacement. Capital has no fatherland. It never did. The British aristocrat who held American railroad bonds was not a trader in his own mind. He was a rational actor maximizing return. That rationality, compounded across an entire class, over an entire generation, is what transfers empires. The First World War was not the cause of British decline. It was the accelerant applied to a fire that was already burning. When Britain entered the war in 1914, it did so as a nation that was already running a current account deficit for the first time in modern history. The war simply forced Britain to liquidate its foreign assets, including its American investments, at distressed prices to fund the conflict. The wealth that the British financial class had spent 40 years accumulating abroad was sold, in 4 years, to pay for artillery shells and officer salaries. By 1919, Britain had gone from the world's largest creditor nation to a significant debtor. The pound sterling, though still formally the world's reserve currency, was now propped up by a fiction. The underlying productive and financial reality no longer supported its global role, but the institutions remained. The Bank of England remained, the London financial markets remained, and most dangerously, the British establishment's belief in their own indispensability remained. This is stage 5, the institutional illusion, and Britain lived inside it for 25 years, from 1919 to 1944, during which the most consequential financial negotiation in modern history was quietly conducted at a resort in New Hampshire called Bretton Woods. At Bretton Woods in July 1944, John Maynard Keynes, arguably the greatest economist of the 20th century, represented Britain in negotiations over the post-war financial architecture. He arrived knowing that Britain was exhausted, indebted, and dependent on American financial support to have even won the war. He proposed a genuinely neutral international reserve currency, which he called the Bancor, that would prevent any single nation from having the privilege of issuing the world as money. The Americans rejected it. They proposed instead that the dollar become the world's reserve currency, fixed to gold with all other currencies fixed to the dollar. Keynes, brilliant and broken by illness, agreed. He had no real choice. Britain needed American loans to survive the peace. The price of those loans was the pound's demotion. The British Empire did not end on a battlefield. It ended in a conference room in New Hampshire, where an exhausted economist signed a document handing the financial architecture of the world to the United States in exchange for credit terms. The handover was complete. Britain retained its institutions, its culture, its language, even its seat on the UN Security Council. But the financial sovereignty, the ability to issue the world's reserve currency and control the terms of global trade, passed to Washington. And Washington knew exactly what that meant. The United States did not merely inherit Britain's role, it redesigned the architecture from scratch and engineered advantages that Britain had never possessed. What America built between 1944 and 1974 was not just a reserve currency, it was a system. A self-reinforcing, deliberately constructed global financial infrastructure that made the dollar not just useful, but mandatory. The first layer was Bretton Woods itself, the dollar gold peg that made every central bank on earth hold dollars as the ultimate settlement currency. The second layer was the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, American-designed and American-weighted institutions that lent in dollars and demanded dollar-denominated repayment. The third layer, and the most consequential, was built in 1974 by Henry Kissinger, and almost nobody in the general public understands it. In 1971, Richard Nixon unilaterally ended dollar-gold convertibility. The Bretton Woods system, as originally designed, was over. The dollar was now a fiat currency, backed by nothing except the promise of the United States government. In theory, this should have ended dollar supremacy. Every other nation could now say, if the dollar isn't backed by gold, why should we hold it? The answer to that question was negotiated in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, in 1974. Kissinger flew to meet King Faisal and made an offer that would reshape the entire global financial order. The United States would guarantee Saudi Arabia's military security, would protect the House of Saud from every external and internal threat, in exchange for one commitment. Saudi Arabia would price its oil exclusively in US dollars, and as the leader of OPEC, it would ensure that every other major oil producer did the same. From that moment forward, any nation on earth that wanted to buy oil, and every nation on earth needed to buy oil, first had to acquire dollars. The dollar had found a new backing, not gold, hydrocarbons. The petrodollar system was an act of financial architecture of breathtaking sophistication. It solved, in one negotiation, the problem that Nixon had created by closing the gold window. It made the dollar indispensable, not through productive superiority. America's manufacturing was already being challenged by Japan and Germany, but through structural dependency. You needed dollars to power your economy. Full stop. For 30 years, this system delivered extraordinary advantages to the United States. It meant that America could run persistent trade deficits without the currency depreciation that would normally punish such deficits. Other nations had to export real goods, cars, electronics, steel, to earn the dollars they needed for energy. America simply had to print dollars. This is what economists call the exorbitant privilege. It is not a metaphor. It is a documented structural asymmetry that allowed the United States to consume more than it produced for 5 decades. But here is where the cycle re-enters the picture. Because the exorbitant privilege also enabled the American financial class to execute the British playbook with unprecedented efficiency. If you can consume more than you produce without immediate consequences, you have no pressure to maintain production. And so, throughout the 1980s and 1990s, American capital did exactly what British capital had done a century earlier. It went offshore in search of better returns. The factories went to Mexico, the electronics went to Taiwan and South Korea, the textile production went to Bangladesh and Vietnam, and eventually, fatefully, the industrial core went to China. Between 2001, when China joined the World Trade Organization, and 2018, the United States lost approximately 5 million manufacturing jobs. Not to automation, to deliberate capital export by a financial class that had decided rationally that Chinese labor was cheaper than American labor, and that the quarterly earnings report mattered more than the long-term industrial base. This is stage 3 of the British cycle, replayed with American capital in Chinese factories. The logic is identical. The timescale is compressed. And the destination is, as we will now examine, a lot more consequential. The United States today sits at the boundary between stage 4 and stage 5. The debt spiral is not a projection. It is a fact. Federal debt has crossed $36 trillion. Unfunded liabilities for Social Security and Medicare, obligations that are legally and politically non-negotiable, are estimated conservatively at $100 trillion. The interest payments on existing federal debt will, within 3 years at current rates, exceed the entire defense budget. These are not doomsday numbers from a fringe analyst. They are the published figures of the Congressional Budget Office, the Federal Reserve, and the Office of Management and Budget. The institutions themselves are telling you the math does not close. The question they are not answering is, what happens when the arithmetic becomes publicly undeniable? The institutional illusion is already operating. The dollar remains the world's reserve currency, but the share of global central bank reserves held in dollars has fallen from 71% in 2000 hours to roughly 58% today. The U.S. military remains the world's most expensive, but it is struggling to recruit, to retain qualified personnel, and to produce munitions at the rate required by current and potential conflicts. The American financial markets remain the world's deepest, but they are increasingly dependent on foreign purchases of treasury bonds to function at current interest rates. The gap between the appearance of power and the reality of power is the most dangerous interval in any imperial cycle. It is the interval in which the informed elite complete their exit, while the general population is still reading the old map. And the elite exit is already underway. It does not look like capital flight in the traditional sense. It looks like corporate structure. The largest American asset managers, BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, now hold more assets outside the United States than inside it. Apple earns more revenue from China, Europe, and India combined than from its home market. The profits of the S&P 500's largest companies are increasingly generated in jurisdictions, currencies, and regulatory environments that have nothing to do with the health of the American domestic economy. This is the structural detachment. The corporate elite are not anti-American. They are not conspirators. They are, like the British financial class of 1880, rational actors following the logic of the cycle. They have built entities whose survival is no longer contingent on American national health. If the American middle class continues to contract, if American infrastructure continues to deteriorate, if the dollar continues to lose reserve share, none of this directly threatens the balance sheet of a company that earns in euros, yuan, and rupees. The BRICS de-dollarization story belongs in this analysis, not as a triumphalist narrative, but as a structural pressure. The expansion of BRICS to include Saudi Arabia and the UAE, the development of alternative payment rails to SWIFT, these are not revolutionary acts. They are precisely what you would expect to see at stage 5 of the cycle. The peripheral nations begin building the infrastructure for the next system before the current one has formally collapsed. Britain watched this happen from 1944 to 1956. The dollar system was built and operational before the pound formally lost reserve status. The next reserve architecture, whatever combination of digital settlement, commodity-backed instruments, or multilateral currencies it takes, is being built right now, not in opposition to America, simply in preparation for what the arithmetic says is coming. The British transition, for all its pain, was managed. It was not an apocalypse. London remained, and remains, one of the world's premier financial centers. The pound sterling still exists. British institutions still function. The British standard of living did not collapse overnight. What happened instead was a long, slow generational compression, a narrowing of possibility, a fading of centrality. The British working class of 1950 did not feel themselves living through imperial decline. They felt themselves living through post-war reconstruction. They felt the rationing and the austerity and the gray skies of rebuilding. Only in retrospect, only from the vantage point of 1980 or 2000 or today, is it possible to see the full shape of what the transition cost them. A century of relative stagnation, a continuous shrinkage of the nation's weight in the world. This is the thing about the transfer that the historians rarely emphasize with sufficient force. It is not primarily an event. It is an era. It is 20, 30, 40 years of a society slowly realizing that the future they were promised is not coming. Not because anything catastrophic happened, but because the cycle turned and they were on the wrong side of it. The most dangerous moment in an imperial transition is not the crash. It is the decade before the crash, when the evidence is visible but the denial is still culturally dominant. That is when individual choices matter most. So what does the cycle teach us about how to read the present? It teaches us 4 things with forensic precision. First, watch the direction of capital, not the direction of rhetoric. Politicians will tell you the country is strong. The financiers will tell you the stock market is healthy. Watch where the money is actually going. When American billionaires buy farmland in the American Midwest and bunkers in New Zealand and citizenship in Malta, they are not reading the same briefing the television anchors are reading. They have the real numbers. The direction of smart capital is the most honest leading indicator of the cycle. Second, track the reserve currency share, not the headlines about it. The dollar's slow erosion from 71% of global reserves to 58% happened over 20 years, largely invisible to the public because it moved at roughly 1 percentage point per year. But compounded, that is a 17-point structural shift in global demand for the currency. At current rates of decline, the dollar will reach minority reserve status, below 50%, within 15 years. That is not a doom prediction. It is arithmetic applied to a documented trend. Third, understand that the next system is already under construction. The mistake the British public made was to believe the pound's decline was an emergency that would be reversed. It was not an emergency. It was a transition. The dollar's reserve share decline is not an emergency to be reversed. It is a transition in progress. The question for any individual is not whether this can be stopped. The cycle answers that question, but where you will be positioned when stage 6 completes. Fourth, distinguish between the fate of the state and the fate of the productive individual. Britain's decline as a reserve currency empire did not destroy the careers of every British person who adapted to the new reality. The British engineers who went to work for American aerospace companies did well. The British financial professionals who built careers in Eurodollar markets did well. The British academics who built institutions that attracted global talent did well. The cycle punishes passive dependence on the imperial dividend. It does not punish skill, adaptability, and clear-eyed positioning. In 1946, that Treasury official who wrote the confidential memo about Britain's exhausted supremacy, his name was Sir Richard Clarke, and he understood the cycle with a clarity that his political masters refused to accept. He did not panic, he did not despair. He spent the next 20 years building the intellectual frameworks that would allow Britain to function effectively in the new American-led order. He saw the cycle, he adapted to it, he remained useful. That is the only sane response to a pattern that is older than any of the nations currently participating in it. The cycle does not care about your ideology. It does not care about your patriotism. It does not respond to speeches or elections or central bank press releases. It turns on its own logic, at its own pace, with the indifference of a geological process. But geological processes are not unpredictable. We know how mountains form. We know how rivers carve their channels. We know, from 500 years of documented evidence, how reserve currency empires rise, peak, financialize, hollow, and transfer. We know the 6 stages. We know the indicators. We know the approximate timelines. We know, most importantly, what the informed actors inside the system do at each stage, and what the uninformed actors fail to do until it is too late. The cycle is not your enemy if you understand it. It is only lethal to those who refuse to see it. The British betrayal was not a crime committed by evil men. It was a pattern executed by rational ones, men who understood the cycle and acted accordingly, while their countrymen waited for a reversal that the arithmetic had already ruled out. The same pattern is executing right now. The same stages are visible to anyone willing to look at the evidence without the distortion of nationalistic hope. The Treasury memo from 1946 was marked confidential. It was not meant for you, but the pattern it described is not confidential. It is written in 500 years of financial history, available to anyone willing to read it carefully and think about it